Welcome to Meta Ethics. This episode, we're going to be talking about anti-natalism. I'm here with a few of my friends. So I guess we should just start by saying roughly where we stand on the issue, maybe a bit how we learnt about it. I feel pretty confident saying that I'm personally definitely an anti-natalist. I first heard about it actually when I became vegan because there's kind of a crossover in those social circles. And then a couple of years ago, I started to get more into the topic when I was learning about existentialism and nihilism. And yeah, that's what made me change.
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty on board with a lot of it. I think I was first introduced to it with through you and through Sam Harris did a podcast with David Benatar, and it's funny because this is something he addresses in Better to Never Have Been. My initial reaction was just you just react to the absurd conclusion of you shouldn't having children is wrong. It seems so distasteful and intuitively so I was just that's fucking dumb. And I remember specifically telling friends about it as a joke, have you guys heard of anti-natalism?
When about
this crazy fringe philosophy. But yeah, I think I'm convinced by it sort of logically, but I think there might be some problems with it sort of psychologically. We can get into this later, but especially because when I compare it to sort of pro-mortalism and seeing how there's sort of a symmetry there where it's I kind of agree with it logically, but I don't want it to be something that's taken to its logical conclusion, by everyone. I don't necessarily think everyone should subscribe to pro-mortalism, but I'm getting way ahead of
out of
everything.
Interest, how much time was there between laughing about it and then accepting it?
I don't know, maybe a year or something.
Right.
Hi, I'm Randy, and I'm interested in philosophy, so I'm happy to join in with this convo. My own views about anti-natalism, I suppose I am kind of on the fence. I kind of in some ways agree, but I also think that there's I believe in the sort of social psychological harms of broadly accepting this thesis, and I think there are kinds of games that you can, as in there are sorts of problems that you can map, what does it mean for people that do exist if we can't solve the problem of anti-natalism, that we actively promote a view of the world that is meaningless and full of suffering and we shouldn't be here. And then if we can't stop anti-natalism, if we can't stop the the sort of biological drives that cause people to be brought into the world, etc., is it worthwhile promulgating a theory, a view of the world which is actively harmful to people that are existent in the world? But also I can see that there are mitigating arguments against that. So yeah, I'm on the fence. I agree with the sort of aesthetic component. It certainly makes you recalibrate and think about, is it worthwhile respawning in the two senses of the word? And I think that it's interesting in lieu of Buddhist imagery about not reincarnating and the decision to overcome this sort of strange impulse to replicate yourself.
Even sort of Schopenhauer, will to life kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think Schopenhauer it's just totally it's sort of I don't know prior to that, but he's definitely the ur-text of anti-natalism.
The book has a few Schopenhauer quotes at the beginning of a lot of chapters. Me?
Well,
yeah, you're actually probably most curious as to me as to what your stance is, because.
All right, well, I'm honored. I first heard about anti-natalism a few years ago. I think when Philosophy Troop did a video on it. I didn't take it seriously. Still don't really take it that seriously. Until Ethan starts talking to me about it on a little more regular basis.
I remember you and only one other guy, Jack, actually, when I first started getting interested in anti-natalism, I asked you about it, and I was very surprised that you knew what it was.
Yeah, I was a very pretentious kid back then who researched a lot of philosophy. Still am. I didn't take it seriously until recently when Ethan wanted to do this video. I read the David Benatar book, Better Not to Have Been, I believe it's called. As he recommended, I thought it was interesting, if not terribly written. and I'm on the fence about this in the same way as Randy. I don't really have an opinion. I'm more curious as to like your thinking and your philosophy on it, because that's what I'm more interested in. I think the Benatar book, it basically just explains what it is, and it has not like very little to offer in my opinion.
I haven't read much of the Benatar book. Is it basically a logical, like further logical examination of the central thesis, which is like, if you do suffer, it's not worthwhile to, like, sorry, if people brought into the world will suffer, which they will, it's therefore not useful, like not worthwhile to bring people into the world, given that there's no positive, like moral obligation to, like, further pleasure to create.
The book is not that like poetic. Really?
That's the first like 50, 60 pages of the book explain things 30 seconds. That's so much easier to understand. Because the book just says just that, but with a lot of like logical notations and philosophical jargon that made it really, really hard to read. But that's basically what like the first third or to a half of the book is about.
I would have to agree. Some of it is a bit hard to get through, and a lot of it, I already had explained in just things like YouTube videos.
I do think it's an interesting book, so I think it brings up a lot of interesting points. I still don't know if I'm qualified to talk about any of them at all, so
maybe we should touch on the asymmetry, which I think is like one of the main
points of
components
contention
of the argument. And there's like different asymmetries he talks about, like a more minor asymmetry, which I'm sort of more convinced by, is like the idea that just like inherently we sort of what's the word, pleasure doesn't really like counteract suffering, and that we sort of suffer more, in a lot of psychological ways, and happiness is much more fleeting than suffering actually is. But yeah, so the broad thing would be that like it is not bad to not bring someone into the world who would have otherwise existed, but it, in a sense it is good, not for them, but it is better not to bring them. Sorry. It's good for them not to have been brought into existence. So the idea being that while, yes, you can point out that like the good doesn't accrue to anyone if no one comes into existence, if you imagine scenario A and scenario B, scenario A, like they are in existence and they are experiencing, a degree of suffering, a degree of pleasure, and never being brought in at all, that scenario B is preferable. Because that's one critique of the asymmetry, right? Is that like the good isn't going to anyone. So some people see that as not being consistent.
Yeah, I think what we have to recognize is that it's I don't know if maybe there's a better way to phrase this, right? But it's not as if it's objective, right? It's looking at it from our current standards, right? So when we abort a baby that's going to be born with a horrible illness, we do see that as a good thing, that they won't have to suffer, right? Whereas we don't see it as a bad thing that there aren't people on Mars or not on Mars being deprived of pleasure or anything like that.
I think it's interesting as well that contextualization of these arguments relates also to some of the presumptions or operating views of things like suffering. Like it's interesting to me that the notion of suffering is like what we're saying when we like even the use of the word pleasure. As opposed to satisfaction or to the kinds of like religious ecstasies that like people who inflicted physical pain on themselves reached and which in a sense alleviated like the sort of horror of the pain. Like that's not what we're focused on. We're focused on pleasure, which seems to me like innately connected with like consumption or with like very short-term bursts of of not satisfaction, but of like dopamine. Like we're thinking in terms of chemicals. I wonder what it means if we refocus the argument in terms of like, those more existentially justifying experiences, like spiritual experiences,
meaning, etc.
Exactly. And I think it's a very Western view, clearly, and like a very modern view of pain and pleasure and of life as a sort of movement between pain and pleasure. Like it's I don't know. I'm curious as to whether that asymmetry that you talk about is true. He gives an example that I remember, which I think does lay out the case well, which is like, would you rather 5 minutes of the worst, like would you go through the 5 minutes of the worst pain imaginable for 5 minutes of the greatest pleasure imaginable. And like I don't think people like thinking about that, you would probably forego that experience because like the worst pain imaginable carries with it like so much. I mean, in terms of like a trauma going forward, and like does seem so much worse than pleasure. But it's also, again, like I could imagine the ancients going like making that decision basically, because if it wasn't pleasure but some sort of like existentially justifying like moment, you know,
I feel like they would be more likely to do it just for the pain, right? They would just be more likely to experience 5 minutes of the worst pain.
And clearly this is like a feedback loop, because if we focus on pleasure and think of the world as like pain and pleasure, then the world becomes pain and pleasure much more than it is necessarily. I don't know what I was trying to get at, but it seemed to me that there was some kind of like question about the exact nature of that asymmetry. Sorry.
There are certainly things that like.
Well, he does intentionally make it vague. But so sorry.
There are certain forms of like, I don't want to like put all utilitarians in one sort of box, kind of so to speak, but like, like you say, it doesn't really account for this like concept of meaning. So I don't remember the name of that South Korean author you sent me, but like in the pro-modalist essay, he was like literally using like units of measurement for like pain and pleasure. He was using like Delors and like I don't remember what the other measurement was, and like it's like, how do you account for the person who has like, basically like a sort of utilitarian, from a utilitarian perspective, like a very painful and kind of just like troubling life, but there's some kind of meaning to be grasped for that, or maybe they engage in like, once again, maybe like a sort of romantic notion of like, someone who's extremely like self-sacrificing. What if in having a painful lifestyle, they benefit other people, significantly more through that process of self-sacrifice? I mean, I guess that's again going back on the utilitarian turf, like, oh, did they do more good than, you know what I mean? Did they overall increase the amount of pleasure? But yeah, I don't know if it's lapsing too much into romanticism to like want to look for meaning as like a sort of third sort of option for analyzing like pain, pleasure, and then meaning. I don't know.
Well,
but it kind of gets to what you were saying, I think, about presupposing like a sort of nihilistic or like, because
like a certain concept of pain and pleasure, definitely.
Yeah, because you're subtracting that third variable basically.
Yes,
you're saying meaning is not a factor in this equation.
Yeah. And like meaning is like self-reinforcing. If you obviously believe in it, then like it becomes real to a sense.
Yeah, that's my big problem with the whole asymmetry of pain and pleasure thing of the book, because he never really defines what he means by pain and pleasure, and what other third options are there beyond that. Like, what if you're a religious person whose meaning to your life is derived from the fact that you endure all these pains so you can find salvation at the end of your life? What if you're someone like that? And I'm sure there are a lot of people like that who Benatar didn't really consider, and that's like something I really wanted him to look into. And also, like the thing is, like, would any of us or anyone alive right now choose to not exist right now, as opposed to just continue living in pain and pleasure for the next 70 years?
Well, I don't think the asymmetry argument in and of itself is really meant to prove anti-natalism. I think it's just meant to show that people that aren't being born are not being deprived of anything, right? And when you're bringing people into existence, they're going to suffer, and it's just meant to compare that to not being born in the first place. And I think it's not meant to prove anti-natalism by itself, and you can also prove anti-natalism without it.
I mean, it is a way of thinking about this problem, and I think that it's interesting at the very least. But I just don't think it's a very sound argument going forward.
I mean, to add on to the difficulty of like numerizing pain and pleasure as well, it sort of like relates to how like the various ways that we can think about like an experience of pain or pleasure. Like, I've like, it's sort of a lot of it has to do with problems of memory as well, and like how memory like relates to pain and pleasure, because for instance, at this moment in my time in my life, does my past matter? Like, does past pain matter? Like,
well, I mean, surely if like you're really thinking that way, then you could just inflict pain on anyone you want, and then it's going to be in the past. So why should they be upset about it?
I mean, I'm not really saying it in those terms. What I'm saying is that there's at least a difficulty in grasping what is even desirable and negative about pain or pleasure. I mean, I think there's like a harm anyway in me inflicting pain that's like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I was really...
I mean, I think you could quite easily expand pain and pleasure, right? So he's intentionally left them vague, right? You could expand pain to mean more than just physical pain. It could mean, like sheer existential horror,
I
right?
guess that's...
It could mean like being embarrassed or, like getting
right,
rejected
so take
from
something
your
like
crush.
being embarrassed.
Or-
Take something like being embarrassed. I don't think that people have a good way of deciding whether being embarrassed is like a negative experience, a good experience. Like it's a negative experience up to a point. Like how we could kind of sum that up versus like a positive experience. Like it just seems super vague to me.
So I feel like we're kind of crossing over into the territory of interest for someone that already exists versus doesn't exist, right? So this is the whole point of the asymmetry argument. You can argue, right? Okay, like let's say you do something and you get really embarrassed. You can learn from it, right? It can overall be a good experience, right? But for someone that doesn't exist, there's no point being born to be embarrassed to learn from that, right? Like you see, getting like, meaningful suffering or anything, that's only remotely relevant to someone that already exists, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the argument. I'm trying to find ways out of it.
I mean, it is a very difficult topic to talk about, and which is probably why I'm not saying anything at the moment.
So I'm interested, like, can we accept this premise that, like, someone who's brought into the world has everything to lose and nothing to gain, but also, like, find ways to, like, take a pro-life approach, basically. And I don't know. Like, and I'm trying to, like, problematize this notion of pain and pleasure to begin with. So, like, the first thing I was trying to do was suggest that there was forms of pain that might be justified with regard, like, given pleasure, which I know that Benatar talks about. And I still think that might be true. And I think there are sort of ways in which someone suffering and someone not suffering might not be a situation of like whether or not it's worth it, because it might not even be coherent to talk about whether a life is worth it, if you know what I mean. Like, as in I guess what we're trying to produce is like a sum, and then based on whether the outcome is positive or negative, we can say this life was worth it. But if granted this nihilistic meaninglessness, like it's not even coherent to say like a life was or wasn't worth it. And then particularly in lieu of like our inability to really come to terms with what was useful or not useful in our own lives. And that has to do with memory, has to do with like the preservation of identity through time and things like that. So that like whilst, I'll just wrap up, like whilst you have someone brought into the world that has like everything to lose, you might kind of find that isn't, it might not even be meaningful to say they lost something. I don't know, now I'm just fucking lost.
Well, maybe I've misunderstood what you're saying here, right? But I feel like you've misunderstood the asymmetry, because he's not trying to make a sum and saying that if it's overall positive, it's good. Like, he stated that if a life was full of nothing but pure ecstasy, it would be neutral. And personally, I disagree with that. I still think it would be wrong to bring someone into existence, even if their life was only good.
Why?
Let me first address this.
And neutral seems crazy.
Basically, because he's not saying if there is a certain amount, or if there is even more pleasure than pain, then it's okay. He's not saying that.
No, I understand that. He's saying that there's no.
That for someone that doesn't exist, pain and pleasure are irrelevant, right? There's no.
I know. I understand the asymmetry, but what I'm saying is that like making this assessment. So like I'm questioning whether or not for someone that does exist, and really that's all we actually, in a way, like that's all that becomes relevant. Whether or not like pleasure does start to have a role in a justifying sense. I don't know, but but I understand the asymmetry. Maybe I'm more like thinking about the utilitarian arguments that Adrian was talking about.
In the example of the, like, the world in which we have like everyone just gets the maximum, they've cranked up to max on full body orgasm for like
just as a
24
small
hours a day.
digression, it really bothered me. Like, I feel like Sam Harris is quite intelligent. It bothered me so much that so much of the podcast was, like, in my opinion, wasted, of Sam Harris just saying, oh, like, but what if life was this good, What about then, right? What if, like, we gave everybody, like, a girlfriend and they lived in this amazing simulation? Like, it's just, it just seemed like he was grasping at straws for half the podcast,
Perhaps, but I think, like, that's a trouble. I feel like that's a trouble, like, even, like, all of us, to a sense, found in Benatar's writing, right? Like, it is very philosophical and kind of logical. So I think that's just because their interests happen to align in that way. They're not, you know what I mean? Like, they weren't necessarily going to have the most practical, like, conversation to begin with.
I feel like Benatar kind of does the same thing as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Because for the entirety of the book, it's like, but what if life is this bad? What if life is this awful?
But he's talking about, like, things that are actually possible, like being born with, muscular dystrophy, or so many awful things really can happen in life. Whereas, like, I'm not going to say it's impossible, right? But I feel like it's quite implausible, at least, well, definitely for our generation and coming generations, that we are all living in some simulation of pure ecstasy. And I would also say, David Benatar very briefly expands anti-natalism to non-human animals in the book, right? But you also would kind of have to, because for me it does expand to non-human animals. This is kind of encroaching on the difference between anti-natalism and Efilism, which we can address later on.
What's the term?
Efilism. But
like, is that extinction of all life?
Like,
essentially.
Desex all animals, okay.
But I feel like for me, anti-natalism expands to non-human animals, right? So if we're talking about living in a simulation, every non-human animal would also have to be somehow plugged into this simulation.
Yeah,
this is going from a philosophical argument.
Yeah,
to
it's more the philosophical
practical one.
concern.
But I don't understand why, like, the amount of pleasure someone has in their life isn't of relevance, though. Because, let's take an example of someone on their deathbed who genuinely feels that their life was worth living, right? That's their own personal testimony.
Yeah.
Why is that not... why is that purely still neutral? Like, isn't Benatar stacking the scales when he
Because if he was never born, he wouldn't care about any of the pleasure.
But he wouldn't have existed. He wouldn't have had an opinion if he never existed, Because the thing is, like...
But again, it's stacking the scales to, like, think about it in terms of, like, those non-existent beings being unmotivated. I mean, maybe they are still motivated in some way.
Well, but then I feel like anti-natalism, you kind of have to accept that there is no supernatural. Because
no, I'm not talking about supernatural, but I'm talking about, like, does it even make sense to think conceptually
about beings who don't exist?
About beings who don't exist, who don't, like, I get the
argument. Like how can you have an opinion if you don't exist, right?
But so just to clarify, that's why I brought up the scenario and A, scenario B, because it's not about positive, you know what I mean? Like, we can only speak of beings who exist. There are no beings who don't exist. So it's inconsistent, like, it's incoherent to say, like, anything good anything beneficial can happen to someone who doesn't exist.
Right.
Does that clarify anything?
No, I see what you're saying. There's one, like, your argument is you're saying that you just don't want to engage with this notion of, like, non-existent beings. I don't know. I'm still, like, struggling to, like, break my way out of this argument, because I can see it's well constructed, but, like, what I'm trying to say is, let me just think about it.
Sure.
I feel like the best argument against the asymmetry is probably what Ming said the other day, that if that pain and pleasure for someone that doesn't exist should be neutral, right? Like, because like, why is the deprivation of pain not bad, right? And why is the deprivation of pain good, right? If the deprivation of pleasure is just neutral. So I feel like that's probably the best way that you can debunk the asymmetry.
I mean, like, another
that's what I was trying to say.
Another objection, well, not really an objection that I have, is, like, I keep asking myself, yes, so what? Like that's one of my main objections to a lot of books on philosophy that I read. Like, yeah, so what? Like you said it wouldn't make a difference if someone has never existed, right? If said the potential life that non-existent person might have had if he or she lived, right? I was thinking, yes, so what? So what if they never existed? So what if their life would have been better or not made a difference if they didn't exist? Yes, so what?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because for me, I feel like antinatalism is so valuable because it has a practical implication of like, I mean, what do you mean like, so what? Like, so unimaginable
of
amounts
suffering of all beings who have ever existed.
like
Do you know what I mean?
unimaginable amounts of suffering can be prevented if we wipe out life today.
I mean, can I ask you something? Like, what if like life on Earth had never evolved? Like, what would you make of that situation? Do you see that as being
I mean,
neutral?
then I never would have existed, and I never would have had an opinion on it.
But my sort of point being that like it's not. Let me change that a little bit. Like, what about the prospect of human extinction in the future as well? So
I mean, that's inevitably going to happen,
yes,
right?
yes, right.
But it's
Which
just a
is-
question of, do you think it's morally desirable that life never emerged, consciousness never emerged,
Like, to you, is it?
versus consciousness emerging and that entailing suffering?
I mean, it depends on what consciousness is, which we still haven't really figured out, right?
No, but like suffering. Do you think a world where life doesn't emerge and so suffering doesn't emerge is better than a world where life does emerge and suffering does emerge?
I mean, how could we ever test that, right?
No, it's not about testing. It's about whether or not you think it's desirable. So if you had a button here, it's a hypothetical. Like, do you not engage in hypotheticals? Like, it's just about whether or not you think that a life with suffering versus a life without, like a world with suffering versus a world without suffering, is any better, basically.
I really wouldn't know the answer to that question, like, right on the spot.
Okay,
I
I mean, it's just an opinion.
No, I mean, I
It's
guess
a
that's-
romantic decision, isn't it? It's not like,
I
yeah.
mean, that's part of the problem with antinatalism that I guess you face, right? Is you're judging
we have a
people
pro-natal
that
bias.
don't exist from the perspective of someone that does exist.
Yeah, like what gave you the authority to speak for them? Like, what if there's like, they could potentially be a religious person who sees all that suffering as good, What if they wanted to be brought into the world? Who knows, right?
Well, I would still disagree with that because
Because you don't think religion's real. Well, like me neither, but like
Well, I feel like
Well,
Ethan,
no, not
Ethan,
because
you're
of that.
particularly uncomfortable with the idea of like a noble lie. I feel like the idea that someone would have a sort of fictitious worldview that doesn't really doesn't really track to reality, but makes them happy and have a sense of meaning. Like, you're not sort of satisfied with that. I feel like.
yeah, I would agree with that, but I don't think that's really relevant to. Sorry, I think I need to process this for a second. But I would say like, well, I would just say even if someone, is like religious and they feel like all their suffering is for something, right? Like they still have to go through all that suffering, and you can just never tell, right? Like, what if this person at 70 realized it was all bullshit and just thought, I wasted my life, And I feel like I'm kind of changing here, but I can segue into what I was talking about before, right? So Benatar says a life of pure ecstasy is neutral, right? I say it's still very bad, but that's because of the consent argument for me.
Because you can't consent to being born.
Yeah.
I mean, I think consent is... Like, obviously, discourses of consent are important and meaningful, and we use them all the time when you're talking about rape, when you're talking about human rights. But it's like... It's a concept that, for me, has, like, like, it has a use value rather than, like, any value in itself. Because, like, I don't even think of consent as, like, a real thing. Like, I think everyone is so historically and biologically determined that the notion of consent is just like a happy fiction. It's very useful for us to like mediate problems in the world, and like it does have a kind of a meaning, but like people don't understand their situation enough. It's sort of like the argument that like it's like a Hegelian argument basically, or it's like a Rousseauian argument. The idea that your own individual will may feel very real to you, but like it relies on a general will, it relies on a society to have meaning, and when it contradicts society, it is in a sense going against your own self-interest.
Could you explain what you mean by use value?
So like take human rights for instance. Clearly human rights are not anything in themselves, and I don't even think they have like an objective moral value, but like they're useful to arbitrate and disputes or like problems, and to stop events of human suffering, basically.
I would even disagree with that, but that's like a whole other debate.
Well, it in the sense that I think consent as a meaningful concept relates to this notion of human rights and the contract, and like can't really be separated from them. And so consent, I just don't think of it as a harm in any way, for there not to be consent, except for the ways in which that might cause suffering. So like I don't think that like the argument that what I'm saying is that your argument that there's no consent does not strike me as like a negative. What's a negative is that there's no consent that causes suffering. But like, for instance, someone who's living, like this is to point out the sort of like difficulty of that, or like of that argument, is that someone who's living doesn't even have a sense that they didn't offer consent, right? Like it's not, like surely crucial to the notion of consent is some sort of discourse, some sort of situation where one person actively refuses some offer of sorts, right? Like whether it's someone who's like a rape victim who's like doesn't give consent, or whether it's someone who is, you know, in some other situation, right? Like a worker who has to work to survive or something, but like doesn't want to. In both of those situations, like there's like consent is only meaningful as this like active sense that you didn't give it, basically.
Well, it's not like, I feel like you've kind of, you know, formed like types of consent, right? It's not as if not having consent is explicitly rejecting an offer, right? Like if I you know, if I went to Adrian's room and I read his diary, right? Like I did that without consent, you know?
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Like I would consider that.
What I'm saying is like not having consent is not a harm in itself.
Right. It's by introducing the idea of consent, you create an additional harm of having that consent
Exactly,
violated.
right?
Yeah.
Like it's an additional harm, which is a social one, which is this sense of like having had your consent violated, and then also it has to do with like the outcomes of consent. So if I do this to you, I don't have consent to do that, right? Apologies, but like clearly the harm of that isn't significant, and we don't really care that I did that to you, right? Like so consent is always tied, I think, inextricably so to like some eventual instance of suffering, and it's about avoiding that.
But if you hit me really hard and you did that without
Right, but
my
that's
consent.
again that's contingent on like the suffering of me hitting you really hard. It's not the instance of my violating consent that matters. It has to do with the fact that like I cause suffering, and the way in which in a society we stop
what if
that
you
happening
didn't
is this
even do
notion of
something
consent.
bad, right? So if you didn't do something bad, if you just went to my room and like rearranged all the furniture, and like it's not even bad, right? In fact, I find it more practical, right? You've like imposed decisions on my life. Would you not consider that a bad thing?
I think I think I can see how it could lead to being interpreted like emotionally as a bad thing. So that might cause you suffering because it's a restriction of your sense of freedom. But I also think that like you can look at this to the way that the individual relates to the state or to the community as a whole. You know, if a government forces upon its subjects something like that, like a total reordering of industry, and in doing so makes a mockery of their sense of freedom, there are forms of social organization where that's just not, like there's not a concept of freedom, which is like a particularly liberal concept, right? Like it's developed in discourses of liberalism, for that to be considered a harm. So like you still rely on this like notion of a harm which relates to a loss of freedom.
Well, I think my whole point saying that if you brought someone to an existence of pure pleasure, and that's bad because it's violating their consent. Maybe my idea of consent is different to the average person's, right? But surely that shows that consent isn't necessarily reliant on harm.
I think that you can say in all sorts of ways that you just don't consent to things. Like I don't consent to being male, white, bespectacled. Like in all senses, we don't consent to anything. And like in a way, you like, and then in what sense?
That's kind of my point.
Right, which is your point, but I'm also saying that that's sort of like, just like, I think what we disagree about is whether it's even meaningful to then use the word consent, or whether or not consent, like what I'm saying is you're extrapolating a notion that comes from contract, like from the kind of human concept of contract, and are applying it to a much broader use. When I think that even it's like reality with regards to like contract is a kind of a, is like for instance, what I'm saying is like violating consent in itself is not a harm. Is the simplest expression of what I'm saying. So it only looks like a harm because in we're used to thinking about consent in horrible contexts like that of rape, where it's tied to situations of like inevitable suffering, basically. But like in a context where it's not suffering, we're not talking like we can call that consent, but it's really just like causality. It's like any sort of causal situation that happens in the world. And then the other difficulty with consent is it even implies a will, a free will that causes the event to occur. And like again, that's like clearly problematizable, although I don't think you necessarily need to emphasize that, which is like people that are acting on biological impulses, on the sort of deception of conceiving themselves as a self, etc., those people are like, can they be said to be consenting? Like they're not, they have no knowledge of the world, so like they're really just automata in like in the sense we're all automata. So I don't know, I just think that like as soon as you poke holes in consent, it just like doesn't really make sense. I mean,
look,
as like a moral basis, right?
My understanding of it is like obviously simpler, right? But it's hard not to see how, from my perspective, right? If someone is going to give birth to a child that's going to, well, I mean, every single person on earth is going to experience unbearable suffering at some point of their life, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, not necessarily.
That's a difficult claim to make.
Well, unbearable.
I mean, like, what if you're born into, like, you know,
okay, every person,
Saudi royal family, or
every
something
person
like
on earth is going to experience suffering at some point in their life, right?
Sure.
So, just to make the example clearer, right? If we imagine unbearable suffering, right?
What do you mean by unbearable? Sorry, go ahead. Let finish the.
Okay. Well, it just seems quite clear to me how the person that. So if you gave birth to somebody who was just going to, you know, suffer non-stop for 30 minutes and then die, right? I feel like the only possible way you could justify that is if you had their permission, which you can't get their permission.
I understand.
And so by extension, if you're going to give birth to someone who's going to live a whole life and they're going to go through a lot of suffering in that life, in the 80 or 100 years they might live, they're going to go through a lot of suffering. I don't think there's much room to argue about that there. The only way you could ever justify that is if, you know, they asked you to do that. If you're going to put someone through harm, there better be a pretty good reason why you're putting them through that harm. And so I feel like, you know, as much as I get on
but again,
well
that's
with my
always
parents,
connected to harm.
they put us through harm.
It's what you're describing is always connected to a notion of suffering.
Yeah,
so like
that doesn't really hold up
the
in a
notion of
situation
consent,
of pure pleasure.
In the situation of pure pleasure, I'd also would like to talk about because I have in a sense suffered in my life, but I really I mean maybe this is the ignorance and bliss of youth, but like times that I have suffered, even in their absurdity, kind of seem. I mean, again, it's super subjective. Like this is all I'm saying is like I don't know if I agree with your notion of that everyone will experience unbearable suffering, or even when we should, like, from what standpoint, like literally in the timeline of their life, we should look back to understand that unbearable suffering. Like, you know, in the moment of that suffering, in like a year later, 5 years later, you know, like I think those all carry with them changes to, like, you know, the ultimate value or like of that suffering, basically.
But again, I think that's only relevant to somebody who already exists, and I don't think simply because they'll learn from it or grow from the suffering is a good enough reason to bring someone into existence and not
I'm not
consider
really saying
their
they would
suffering.
learn from that suffering, but I also
Or
understand
that it wouldn't be seen as a bad thing later on.
Yeah,
Because I feel like
Well,
birthing someone and forcing them to suffer in the first place, I don't think that the later reflection on it
well, I mean,
justifies that.
it's sort of the real difficulty we're running into now is that we're trying to look at things from such a perspective where suffering, I think, even starts to look less meaningful in a lot of ways. And I think part of the problem has to do with this distinction between the suffering in the moment of suffering and suffering after the moment of suffering, where it's like it's just, I feel like that like makes it very difficult to decide whether suffering was even a bad thing to have happened in the first place.
Can I just add one thing here? I don't want to use this definition
yeah.
but just to bring it up, but we'll continue to use the old definition of suffering. But there's this notion, I don't know if it's actually in Buddhism, but I've heard people describe it as like, they distinguish between suffering and pain. So pain being the physical symptoms, and then there's the kind of mental, like this sort of psychological suffering that's attached to that. So if you're going in for, I don't know, like an injection or something, like there's all this anxiety that's leading up to it, and like you say, even looking back to the past. So, whether or not like some state of like enlightenment is possible, there's ways of like, really reducing that suffering and just bringing it down to the sensation of like the pain. So the pain is still very real, but I think to a large extent you can curb some of that suffering, especially where it comes to anxiety and considering like your life. You know what I mean? Like personally, I did used to have a lot of kind of hang-ups about the past and really like feel that as like a lived experience in the present, but it's just not. You're just always in this like, endlessly kind of flowing pleasant present moment. So I don't know, the past is really bizarre. You only really exist in one kind of stratum of time. So I really resonate.
And we have to contextualize suffering, right? Like in terms of this chronology, which is the thing. It's like, it makes it so hard for me to decide what was worthwhile, or like rather what was actually like negative suffering. Like, are there forms of suffering in my past that would say I prefer that not to happen? Like, no, even though I wouldn't have wanted to go through them. And even though they exist permanently in space-time, maybe. Like, it's not... you see what I'm saying? As in, it becomes difficult to make that sort of decision about whether or not that... Like, I would rather that didn't happen, if you know what I mean. But I get that there's, like, this whole argument about, like, nothing to lose and... everything to lose and nothing to gain. It's quite hard to argue out of.
I mean, like...
I think the rest of the tapestry is less convincing, to be honest. But like, I think that is it's a strong argument. I mean, I think the point is like, are there really no ways that we can value things positively or believe that like it's valuable for things to come into existence? Like as in. Yeah, I mean, wait, express the asymmetry again. Sorry.
Okay, so. Somebody exists. They're going to experience pleasure, which is good.
Yeah.
They're going to experience pain, which is bad, right? Somebody doesn't exist. They're going to not experience pleasure, which is considered not bad, because somebody that doesn't exist has no relevance to pleasure, right? We don't consider it a bad thing. All the people that don't exist, that don't get all that pleasure, whereas somebody doesn't exist and they're going to be free from all the pain, right? And it's not in the sense like, we should be ecstatic, right? That like, Ming, I'm so glad you haven't had kids yet because they're free from pain, Ming, It's more so that like, I mean, to me, I think it makes more sense if you consider like someone being prevented from coming into existence, right? Like me personally, I would have probably had kids unless I found out about anti-natalism, and I'm happy that I'm not going to have them now because they're never going to have to go through any suffering.
So let's examine the situation of the person who wasn't brought into existence and doesn't experience pleasure. The sort of immediate intuitive response is that's not a bad thing to have happened. But I think that like in the absurdity of the notion that like all the beings that haven't come into existence not experiencing pleasure or not experiencing life, that is a negative thing, might we see the mirror image absurdity of all the beings that don't exist that don't experience suffering is a bad thing. It's like the absurdity of that. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to say is that like it's very clear to us that suffering is bad. We've got no way of talking about pleasure, and so we fall back on the notion of saying that being that doesn't experience pleasure is a good thing, whereas a being that doesn't experience suffering is a bad thing. Oh, is a good thing. Fuck, I don't know. I mean, now I'm seeing that doesn't really hold, but yeah. I think part of it has to do with just like the way in which we can easily conceptualize the negativeness of like the negative quality of suffering. But like with pleasure, we're kind of left grasping at straws, and that pleasure / satisfaction / like existential justification. I don't know.
So I wanted to touch one thing that he talks about in the book, which is the idea of like progressing towards extinction. And so we can talk about we can talk about in terms of animals, we can talk about in terms of humanity. So it's almost like one, what if we just took it to its conclusion and said like we absolutely need to end human life now, like no more, as that's not to say suicide, but that all humans should voluntarily choose to not have any more children. He does talk about the idea of like there being some kind of transition, like this is obviously very theoretical, it's not actually going to happen. But I was actually surprised that he found that he proposed a transition in which the suffering of the sort of last people would be, he saw that as being greater than it would be otherwise. So as in, how to put this? So if you have 7 billion people who are, dying with the notion in their heads that like this is the last, this is the end of the human species, that would constitute greater suffering. Like you could actually justify having a phased extinction of subsequent smaller generations in order to achieve that goal. So you would have maybe like, I don't know, pick a number, like 10,000 people or 1,000 people who were like the last group, and they would have bear that existential burden, but it better 1,000 people than 7 billion.
Well, it's more so like, wait, sorry, do you mean in the sense of like that compared to wiping everyone out?
No. So still just like abstaining from procreation.
So he's basically saying it's better for like 1,000 people to bear the existential burden of we're going to be the last people on Earth than 20 million people on Earth that's going to like, oh no, the entire environment is going to destroy us and we're all going to be killed.
Well, it would be more than that, right? It would be like however many millions, billions of years of future generations.
But I don't think he's I don't think he's suggesting millions of years. I think he's suggesting like maybe a few generations. Well,
I mean like phasing down, right? The suffering of the last generation, right? I think he's saying will be worth preventing the suffering of if we continue.
But that last generation should be smaller than the current one.
I mean, to me, like that.
Well, it would have to.
Sorry?
Right? It would have to be small.
Yeah. In the event of a phased extinction, that's what I'm saying. Would you advocate a non-phased extinction?
Well,
in theory, obviously, like.
Well, yeah, it's in theory, right? But I feel like if we're going to talk about extinction,
I can easily see this being used as the basis of a genocide in the next 30 or 40 years.
Absolutely no killing, not condoning any killing at all.
But why?
Look, it's tough, right? Because I don't want this topic to be a book review, right? So I'm happy to talk about this, right? But my views on like how we would hypothetically go extinct aren't necessarily gonna like they're gonna be different to David Benatar.
But yeah, if you wanted to raise anything.
So, I'm not so sure about like how well a phased extinction could go. Like you can just give everyone like, we could just sterilize every single human, right? And then just like, but then as we die, just like hope that the young people like don't find a way to reverse that or anything.
But that strikes me as being a very genuine issue of consent. Like not objectively, but in the sense that like people would find that.
I think if the whole world became anti-natalist, right? Well,
good luck.
Okay. Sure.
Look, I feel like
go for it.
Right, for the purpose of argument, if we decided we want to prevent all this suffering, right? The way I personally would go about it would not be a phased extinction. I don't know if this is even possible with, whatever tools we have on the planet, right? But the way that I think would probably be best to go about it would be to like, all right, A, just as a backup, like send some kind of message out into space explaining why we did this in case any aliens find it, then they can learn about antinatalism, right? And then it would probably be destroying the planet.
Why?
Well, because I don't really see like
Because
how
like,
how a phased extinction would really like work. I don't think that would address non-human animals.
But okay, yeah, but I mean, okay, so if we include non-human animals, is your objection like that life will eventually evolve again on the basis of there being like plants and stuff?
Well, I mean that's the thing. Like, all right, this is I'm not a scientist, right? So this might sound just like batshit crazy, right? But I've heard it said that like all in anti-natalist communities, right, that all sentient life should be wiped out, and I feel like for good measure we should wipe out hypothetically non-sentient life just in case it does evolve to become sentient.
Well,
Oh boy.
that's the death drive on steroids, my boys. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to compare then like a sort of anti-natalist veganism with like an environmentalist veganism, which is like wants to work against the mass extinction of animals caused by like climate change and shit like that. But I'm actually way more sympathetic to like I am sympathetic to this argument that like life entails suffering, and so we should try and stop this like constant like life's recreation of life like again and again.
Yeah.
But I also think that like, and I also think that there needs to be some kind of a language or way of expressing the mitigating factors around suffering, which I think genuinely is existential pleasure and da da da. And maybe there's no like positive duty to bring a being in the world to experience pleasure, or maybe there's no a being that doesn't exist has no like gains nothing from like being brought into the world to experience pleasure. But regardless, you can't understand the pain that we've agreed is a negative, the suffering which we've agreed is a negative, without reference to pleasure in a way. So maybe pleasure is introduced as like a necessary concept by reference to pain, and becomes like a way in which you can mitigate that. I don't know. I don't think that's even very.
It was pretty good. You reckon we exhausted everything we needed to talk about?
I wanted to mention
Wouldn't say so,
the
yeah.
esoteric / exoteric argument, which like relates to whether or not it's like, so Benatar even says that he's basically convinced. Oh no, I feel like there's a genuine argument against this. I was gonna say that this whole idea that since anti-natalism is like never gonna happen, as in like there's never gonna be like full acceptance of anti-natalism, that it's not worthwhile to like that, and given that spreading this worldview of anti-natalism like eventuates more suffering, because you're basically celebrating the notion that there's no meaning to the world and so you should suffer, whether or not there's like a kind of there's a question of whether or not you should spread this information exoterically to like make it public knowledge, or whether you should keep it private knowledge. There's a fair argument against this, which is the same one that comes along with, say, veganism or other types of moral, like any moral issue, which is like, just because you can't do something 100% doesn't mean that like there's not a marginal benefit that you get for every every life that's not eventuated.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to raise, and like this, feel free to cut this, but like delving into kind of population ethics, because I think then you can derive like a very practical, you know what I mean, it's almost an extra justification for kind of like controls on population, even if you don't accept the kind of conclusion of anti-natalism as being like, you know, or don't think it's possible, you could sort of advocate it on sort of moral grounds. Because one thing I've encountered with people, you know, people on the left, is like a real sort of opposition to talking about population, you know, because they sort of interpret it as being kind of racist, especially when it applies to the third world. But I do feel like there's a genuine philosophical argument there that they kind of dismiss, and that troubles me, because then it kind of ties into disability, which maybe we can talk about later. But do you see what I mean? If you don't condemn bringing in children into the world in third world countries who are just going to have shitty, a shitty existence basically, and these parents will have like absolutely, I'm not blaming them, but they'll have like lots of children, and then they are going to live lives of suffering, and pretty much like a lot of people would agree on that. You don't need this, asymmetry or whatever. I guess what I'm getting at is like, could we embrace try to make those arguments within, it just troubles me that that's not wanting to kind of be, and I don't think it is necessarily racist, not trying to be dismissive of those people, not attempting to seem sort of chauvinistic or imposing values or whatever, eventuates in more suffering. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, it's the same argument they make with disability, which is like the very real situation of suffering that certain types of coming into the world with certain types of disability cause, regardless of the societal structure. So like if you come into the world with like chronic pain, that's clearly a situation of disability which is not socially contingent. There's no socially right, like whether or not how we can work against upholding like you say, chauvinistic standards of ability, of wellness, etc., of health, whilst also recognizing that like in being overly sort of tiptoeing around this issue, you eventuate suffering because you allow structures to exist which in trying to be sort of blind to the situation allow this like needless suffering basically. Yeah.
And I think that's almost like reflective of like, I mean, maybe this is just very personal, but like the sort of drive of evolution itself as being this really like just blind, like utterly stupid kind of force that, just seeks to reproduce itself, kind of the will to life. And in doing so, has generated all this suffering kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the beings produced by evolution, the only way they can thrive is by like consuming other beings, right? So it's just like, that's the only way of like, it's pretty much just Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, I'm just
the will to life as being a source of suffering. Yeah.
So I take it, I mean, I've mentioned it to you, right? But I take it you guys haven't heard of Efilism?
I've heard the word a few times.
I feel like I'm getting a sense of what it is.
Well, I feel like, I mean...
No, when you were creating the YouTube channel, you sent me a list of the tags that it has, and that's one of the words, and I searched it up, and I have a vague idea of what it is.
Yeah.
My feeling is that like...
Antinatalism extended to animals, right?
Well,
Non-human
not quite, right? So it's Efilism, like life backwards. So EFIL. Right?
You turned me off it, dude. I'm sorry.
Know, right? I feel like it's not the best word.
I can't endorse that shit.
It was
That's insane. Fuck with that.
The word was coined by a YouTuber.
Of course it is.
In Mendham, who is like kind of like an old YouTuber. Like his account is like 16 years old or something.
Wow.
But he's always been talking about anti-natalism and Efilism, right? So I guess the problem with anti-natalism can be that it's like too vague, right? Like it's just a negative value to birth, right? So it could be talking about like, overpopulation or environmentalism, whereas Efilism is like specifically against life, right? That everything should be wiped out. So from talking with you, Ming, it seems like
30 years later, this ideology is going to be responsible for some sort of genocide.
Well,
but could I prompt you on the point of like animal suffering? Because like humans, we have all these means to kind of justify our suffering.
It's probably worth noting for the audience that we're all vegan aside from Ming. Which I think there's a crossover between anti-natalism and veganism, but just briefly, my own personal view is that even though I think everyone should be vegan, I think especially anti-natalists should be vegan. However, you don't have to be vegan to be an anti-natalist, and vice versa. But sorry, you
but so it's a question of like, so humans, we sort of, have all these ways of sort of justifying suffering in our life, and obviously we experience pleasure, and we kind of are able to like craft a meaning out of it. But like animals sort of don't have that, and in a sense, they lack a conceptual experience of suffering. Do you know what I mean? Like it's almost just reduced to the physical symptoms. Obviously, they experience some emotional distress, but it's not like
they definitely do.
It's not like a conceptual thing. Like
is it more a question of them not being aware of suffering as something in itself?
Yeah.
It's like a metacognitive.
Like if I told you that you were going to die tomorrow because you were going to be sent to like the gas chamber, whereas there's not only is there no way of communicating that to an animal, but like they don't like. I mean, it's kind of incoherent to say even if they could understand us, but do you see what I mean? They don't have this, they may not even be aware of their own death, for instance. But what I would raise to Ming is like, if you just assume the absence of human beings, and so we were just talking about animals.
Yeah, sure. Go on.
In that case, do you find sort of antinatalism compelling? Do you think there's something inherently worthwhile about animal life that is, would be worth them propagating and continuing to reproduce?
I mean, they wouldn't really know what to do, right? Given their level of intelligence, they will just perpetuate that cycle.
But I guess on balance, do you think it's like a bad thing, or do you think it's neutral? Do you think it's good?
I think it's a neutral thing. And I don't think I have authority to speak on behalf of animals because I don't really know what is going on.
That's true.
This is kind of.
I mean, you
I
are an
eat them,
animal.
so.
I also think that I think it's also like interesting to de-anthropomorphize because I question as well like the sort of how discontinuous human types of suffering are. Like, I think the sort of suffering of like a cow when her calf is taken away, etc. Like these are sort of forms of suffering that find very easy analogies for human beings to understand. And like how much the like metacognitive awareness of suffering, ability to construct narratives, like, I don't know. I think it raised a lot of interesting questions about consciousness and self-consciousness, and like whether or not acts of self-consciousness are really just inevitable expressions of like prior consciousness, like whether or not an animal experiences some sort of internal mechanism to alleviate pain or mediate pain in a way that we find expressed also through acts of self-consciousness. So deciding that like, you're going to create this like tapestry of meaning which justifies it. Whether or not that tapestry of meaning presupposes a more fundamental mechanism of alleviation, which you would find also in animals, and which only like, do you see what I'm saying?
I don't know if I follow.
As in, it sort of relates to like my general position or feeling that like a lot of notions, a lot of highfalutin philosophical concepts, etc., particularly acts of self-consciousness where you're examining yourself and thinking about yourself, that those are like prefigured and made possible by more fundamental emotional and like sort of self-aware
Okay, so
forces, basically.
as an analogy, could I say like you sort of have like with the structure of the brain, right? Like you have the brainstem at the bottom, and it's used to like, it's at the more sort of primitive area of the brain and deals with pain and stuff, and then you kind of have these more like metacognitive.
Yes, and that's just like cope. Like that's like the cope faculty, right? Like, and the question is like, is there some sort of like emotional level cope faculty that animals also have?
No, totally. Because I wanted to clarify, like my agreement with Ming was sort of in like a Cartesian kind of sense, because like you can't really make statements about other people either, right? Absolutely, I don't know anything about the inner subjectivity of an animal, but nor do I know it about you guys. And like from a pure skepticism point of view, you can't really tell if other people are experiencing pain.
Yeah, exactly.
In that cognitive sense as well, right? We could just be automata responding.
But then, of course, as reasonable people, we know that that's like not true.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
Okay.
As in, like the whole. I mean, if we take, say, our status in the world based on what we know from science to be true, which is already presupposing the truth of like a broader reality, and so it's tautological. there's all sorts of reasons why our subjective experience of the world is not terribly unique, even if it's like is terribly unique, if you know what I mean. So like everything is sourced by evolution, and everything is working towards this like pretty clear goal we've worked out, which is like reproduction, existence in the world, and like that's like the terms of reality. Things exist that exist, and so it's not strange for me to think that like the pain that I experience, based on this like presupposing this broader picture, that like my pain is like analogous to your pain, is analogous to an animal's pain, etc., etc. But again, that's just like explicitly disavowing a skeptic position.
But yeah, it's sort of
proceeding
needlessly
on.
skeptical, like
Yeah, I don't know.
because otherwise, why even bother talking about anti-natalism?
Yeah.
Or reducing suffering in general.
Ming, I'm curious about you. So from talking with you, it seems like you would not call yourself like an Efilis, right? So I'm wondering in like what senses do you think it's bad to have a child?
Well, I think it's definitely irresponsible for certain people. I think, if you don't have the financial means to support a family, right? I definitely think that's not a reason to have a child. That's one. Or if you have, 12, 13 kids already, and you bring another kid into your family, especially if you live in a country where it's difficult to support yourself. I also think that's irresponsible.
Is that the fear of the second example? Is that because of overpopulation or like the suffering of the kids?
The suffering of the kids and the suffering of the family, not overpopulation. I think overpopulation is a myth. I heard somewhere before that you can fit all of human population like in like a quarter of Texas or something. And the thing is, like, America throws away 40% of the food it produces. So I don't think there is like a serious concern about overpopulation. I think that's about seriously a myth from like the 1800s.
Yeah, I would more or less agree with that. I think part of the myth of overpopulation is that we would have to change the way we consume.
I mean, the extent to which I agree with the anti-natalist position is just that I think sometimes in situations it is irresponsible to bring a kid into the world. But to say that it's morally wrong, I think you definitely need to convince me with a lot more arguments than what has been presented to me.
So, like, simply the fact that because they're going to suffer, and if you never had them, they wouldn't suffer. That's not a good enough reason.
No, that's not a good enough reason because it's subjective for everyone.
So, if you had a child, right?
Mm-hmm. Well,
and that child said,
well, assuming someone wants to marry me, which is like very unlikely. Go on.
I mean, you can say that it relates to like types of suffering, which I think is what Ming is saying. It's like
because it's subjective.
You're clumping together all kinds of suffering. Like the image of suffering is horrible when I think of like the really, really horrible stuff that people experience. But like there's clearly like you might say that some forms of suffering are neutral, like they're not actually negative, and that like that assessment, which is romantic, by the way, like it's just an aesthetic assessment at the end of the day, but that even according to like my aesthetic framework,
your aesthetic frame, bro.
What was Ethan about? What were you about to say to me?
Like in like taking away from like looking at it logically and philosophically, right? If I had a child, right, that's pretty irreversible, right? And one day he comes up to me and just says like why did you have me? How could you possibly justify this? There's no way that I could
dude,
personally
so
there's no way
if that was my kid, I gotta say.
I mean, like,
just shut the fuck up.
How many times does that actually happen? So like, would that ever realistically happen?
There's no way that I could possibly justify that to my child, like especially if something really bad happened to her. If I had a daughter and she was like raped and she said, why did you bring me into existence? There's no way that I could ever justify that.
But you weren't responsible for her being raped.
Well, but I feel like in a sense you are, if you because she wouldn't have if you never gave birth to her. I'm obviously the person really at fault is the rapist, right? But if she just says like, I just wish I was never born. There's nothing I can say. There's nothing I can possibly say to defeat that. So I wonder how, like, if you had a child and that child went to you and said, like, like, how could you do this to me, Dad?
But it still
What would
seems
you-
relevant
what would
to
you
your
possibly
analogy
say?
that this girl is raped. Like, that's the point that's sort of raised. Like, if the kid just had a normal fucking life and just came to you and said that.
Yeah, but
first of all, they're having said
even
that
a
is
normal
only
life
ever...
has a lot of suffering.
They're
right?
having
You
said
can-
that
you-
is
I think-
only ever expression.
Well, you can have
Let
a
me
really...
finish.
yeah.
They're having said that is only ever an expression of a social milieu whereby that statement even has coherency. Like, if you lived in a stable, in like a normal, in a sort of healthy community, that question, and if you lived like people used to live, right, as in like with the conceptual frameworks they used to manage the world by, that question is just incoherent. So like, it's only now that question is posed. And I think like you have to contextualize it like that, because it in a way that question is always symptomatic of something else wrong, right? Like that question doesn't emerge as being meaningful unless some prior unless in
The
some way
question
the
of how could
broader
you justify...
yeah, like
Yes.
the person that poses that question is not a happy person, basically.
Yeah, and even,
No, I
even
don't.
so,
I think that's not. Well, look.
Like happy people don't ask that
depends, right?
question, right?
Well, there's a difference between like happy and having a good life, right? Would you say that? Because I feel like you can have a
Sure, I
really
mean,
good
someone-
life, and then you could just have an existential crisis, and then you're fucked.
Yeah, I mean, what do you mean by then you're fucked? Like, you have an existential crisis. You like, at what point are you fucked?
I mean,
In the
like,
moment of the- in the moment
like
of the
you could be
existential- wait, let me
suffering
finish. Are
from
you-
the existential crisis,
Right, so-
even if like,
Sure.
which is then this is a ridiculous
And then this is
example.
a
But if you
situation-
were not suffering in other forms,
But then this is a situation where chronology matters, because prior to that, just like it's relevant to say that prior to that existential crisis, you weren't suffering, and during that existential crisis, you were suffering. It's a great question. Like, the real question is about what happens after the existential crisis. And once you've got these three different inputs, it becomes like very difficult to decide what was a worthwhile existential crisis, which type of existential crisis just didn't matter in the end. Like, it's just unclear to me. Like, in other words, assigning a definite negative value to suffering is what I'm critiquing. Like, there's some forms of suffering that in the finality of things were neutral. They didn't matter, right? Like, it was an illusion that they mattered, and an illusion that was perpetrated by the fact that it was believed they were mattered. As soon as it was believed that they didn't matter, then that suffering as a historical fact became irrelevant and neutral.
well, I don't know about that, right? Because if you just take the example of like having to spend 40 hours a week working some shitty job, right? Maybe when you're 70 and you're retired and you're like, you're just going on cruises all the time. Like, you might think, I don't really care that I wasted 40 years of my life working at a job, right? But I wouldn't say that it's okay.
That's why we need to change the system of how we work and overthrow the current system.
Well, not arguing with you on that, right? That's why I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that it's okay if people are, wasting 40 years of their life working shitty jobs.
I mean, surely the problem with that has to do with whether or not they're happy doing it, or whether they're being forced to suffer doing it. And I think it problematizes the notion of suffering when you can say, hold on, that person doesn't care about it like 40 years on. Because then clearly that's like a different type of suffering to forms of suffering which like are negative, like someone dying, forms of suffering that like have no like neutralizing reconciliation. In other words, maybe suffering is more of a process than like a single value, like a single negative or positive value.
Why should they have to go through that process?
As in, what I'm saying is, it's not about them having to go through that process. It's about when that process has finished, it doesn't matter that they went through that process. Just like for me, all the forms of suffering in my life, there's not one that I would wish didn't happen to me. And it's not about me growing. If I think about them, I respond with an acerbic laughter. That's not about like being happy or anything. Like, I just think it's silly. Like they're just silly moments in my life. None of them were meaningful. All of them were forms of suffering. And if I dwell on them, there are ways in which that can restart the suffering. But like by the end of it, it's neutral to me. Like it's not as if I could say right now that my life has been a negative sum. And I think that like deciding that suffering is innately a negative sum and that isn't neutralized with hindsight. Like, in a way, our moral situation has to be judged by the present moment in time. And that present moment in time is one that, as it moves forward, does neutralize forms of suffering.
Well, I feel like we kind of gone in a circle, and I'm not really sure if I can.
The last 30 minutes.
I mean, the relevance of that is that the relevance of that, like, to reiterate, is that Benatar's central claim is that all forms of suffering are negative. And what I'm saying is that there are some forms of suffering that are neutral, that are inconsequential.
I mean, he never really defined suffering. That's like a huge problem.
Right, and so if
I think it's pretty easy to define it yourself.
And so if you can no
Yeah,
longer...
yeah, that's the same, because everyone's going to define suffering differently.
If you can no longer say that suffering will eventuate, right, as like an innate negative about life, then you can no longer say that life is innately negative, because now you've introduced the possibility of just a neutralizing suffering, a suffering that was inconsequential by the end of it.
But I just feel if you try to explain that to someone that's going through suffering, it just makes no sense. Like that's like, sorry, I don't mean this like.
I actually disagree. I think
insult,
that's sort of the best form of comfort, because we all have,
really
because hear me out. We all have these moments. You know what I mean? There's certain things that, like, you know, breaking up with a partner or death or something, like. You know, you're always going to move past that to some extent. You're always going to move on. So to have someone, especially if it's your first time where you've like lost a relative or someone, to have someone to say like, it does get better, you're going to feel differently about this in the future. To me, that's like the best form of consolation there is. Even though you're, you know, as Woody kind of rightly points out, you're sort of forever entrenched in the present moment, and like the future isn't, you know, really real in any meaningful sense. Just in terms of like almost like a practical approach of like, you know, what can I do for this person?
It might
point out to them, and especially if they've had past experiences. But you know, regardless, at some point in the future, they're going to look at this present moment differently. I think that's the only real source of comfort there is.
It might be the best source of comfort there is, but it's a pretty shitty source of comfort, right? Like no one has ever like, you know, maybe they felt a bit better, right? But no one's been cured of their suffering from someone saying, oh, you know, it'll get better.
You're right. You're right.
I totally disagree. I mean, I think suffering has a strong component of it that is an illusion, right? Like forms of existential suffering are not as cut and dried as they seem. They're always an innate value judgment, which is then in some way clouded by, like, you know, like this sort of conceptual framework or something. Like the best escape for suffering, especially forms of suffering which are like kind of inward, is some kind of reconciliation of the fact that like suffering is meaningless, right? That like suffering is absurd, that it happens, and that like that in itself is an escape, a form of positive thinking which escapes suffering, or has the potential to escape suffering. But the other point I'm making is that there are types of suffering. So someone dying, it might be harder to justify that. But I also think that like, again, it's still about how you respond to that suffering. And like, since our moral judgment is always contextualized in a particular frame of time, particular moment of time, I would argue, then it means that when you talk to that person, you know, 20 years after their parents died, say, and they no longer conceive of it in negative terms, like, to me, that's now a neutralized suffering. And it's a form of suffering which is like if you say, would you rather your parents are still alive? I mean, maybe they'd say yes. I mean, probably they would, right? But it's sort of a different, it's sort of like, I think there's a certain status that we give to events that have happened in the past that means that they have a sort of, which is similar to the way we conceive of nature, which is that this is how things have been, and given that we can't change them, they have a kind of quaint, like, naturalness to them, if you know what I mean. It's just sort of like how things happened. And so there are ways in which we, in the present moment, think of experiences of suffering in this like neutralizing way.
I would say that I generally agree with you. I just disagree that you know, because suffering can get better. You know, I'm not gonna go into explain it the way you have, right? But because of that, I just disagree that simply due to that fact that it's okay for someone who has not been born and could escape all the suffering to go through it.
Can I pose the argument more logically and philosophically? The argument is this: there are three instantiations: the moment before suffering, prior to suffering, the moment of suffering, and the moment after suffering, when suffering is like neutralized or contextualized and made sense of. The fact that suffering has these three instantiations, all of which have different values, means that we can't meaningfully handle suffering as a single concept, and think of it not contextualized by time. We have to be thinking about suffering relative to different instantiations of time. So like suffering 1, suffering 2, and suffering 3, and that means that the time that is most relevant to us has to probably be the present. And so from that perspective of the present, forms of suffering which
I'll let you finish.
In the past no longer have a negative value, but actually have a neutral value. Rather than so in other words, bringing people into life, it's not about like as in it's difficult because I see the
I wouldn't say that the past suffering is now neutral. I feel like the best argument we could make is the past suffering was bad, and your present suffering of that past suffering is neutral. I feel like that's only useful to someone that already exists or is going through suffering. And I also feel like when somebody hasn't been born yet, you're always talking about their potential future suffering.
Yeah, you always meant their full life, aren't you? Yeah, I see that argument. I mean, maybe that's the thing about Benatar's argument. Maybe it relies on this like de-chronologize, this like view of suffering, this form of suffering which is not related to like memory and to do with like time. Because like it seems clear to me that whilst I wouldn't ever want to experience suffering that I've experienced in the past again, I also just don't have any reason to.
I feel like you're kind of making like a stoic argument. Like
it's not a stoic argument because I'm not really talking about like a psychological, like the best like I have been at times, but I'm not. It doesn't need to be connected to like the best psychological outlook to approach suffering with. It's more to do with whether or not we can say that suffering is always negative. And I'm saying that in the event that suffering stops being that suffering is not negative or like a priori always, that suffering is a process which by the end of it becomes trivial and not negative and becomes neutral.
Look, if someone goes through immense suffering, right, and at the end they come out of it and they say, and you could argue this happens almost every time, right? And at the end they come out of it and they say, you know, like people often say this about like childhood bullying, that it's not that bad now, or in fact they were even glad it happened, right? Okay, I feel like that's good, right? Good for you, you know? But that doesn't mean that you should have a child that's going to go through all this suffering, or that it's okay to go through suffering.
I see what you're saying, but it almost makes incoherent narratives of suffering is what the point that I'm raising is that narratives about suffering, which become incoherent as soon as it's no longer clear whether or not suffering is is like a priori negative, or whether it's just a neutral, and like it means that I don't know.
For instance, it's why I think like a measurement of pain is a little bit incoherent in the long run. You know, you can test the pain in the moment, and you can test suffering 3 like at a later point, right? So how do you square that if you were trying to come up with how many dolors and how many like sort of positive life points, fucking whatever you accumulate during your lifetime at the end of the video game? Like, go.
That's the point that I'm making, right? So when Benatar talks about a life, this hypothetical full life span of this non-existent person coming into existence, I'm saying that you can't just talk about a full lifespan, that you have to be singling out moments of that lifespan. So the person who is brought into existence, and then you look at the end of their lifespan where they're on the deathbed and they go, oh, it was all fine, that it returns to a neutrality. So in other words, you didn't eventuate suffering, it was just as neutral as it was to begin with.
So
because you have to focus on a one moment in a time frame rather than the full totality of the time frame, which I've tried to argue is incoherent because of the different types of suffering that you're encompassing and trying to juggle. the situation of like if you compare it to like the dude on his deathbed who's about to die, it's like, yeah, life was fine. Then it's a question of neutrality, just as it's a question of neutrality for the non-existent being.
Surely, like, the real conclusion of your argument is just that all suffering is neutral.
Yeah, that's what...
Not necessarily, because the person on their deathbed might really like loathe those situations.
Well, how do you know that?
So I'm not
how do you
saying-
know the person on their deathbed? I mean,
No.
Obviously, I don't have to
But that's
say
what I'm
this.
saying. I'm not saying that all suffering's. I'm not saying that all suffering's neutral.
Yeah, I feel like maybe we should kind of.
I'm saying that suffering is not a priori negative. That it has this potential for neutrality, and so it's not. And since we can't meaningfully talk about suffering except contextualized to a moment in someone's life, rather than in the context of an entire life, it's not possible to say that like a priori suffering is negative in the way that like is necessary for Benatar's argument to have like full coherence.
Well, I think I understand your view, and I also think Ming's right. We're kind of like beating a dead horse at this point.
I don't know. I feel like that's a good point. Like I feel like that's a reasonable objection that in some ways
It might be, but I'm not sure that I can really take that anywhere at the moment. So if we can move on to like a different point, that would be good. I'm happy to finish up here unless you guys want.
I think I've said everything I wanted to say.
Yeah, I'm fine.
yeah.
All right. Well,
It's been fun.
It's been fun, yeah.
like and subscribe to Meta Ethics and share with all your friends these happy little videos we make. Thank you all for being in the video and discussing this topic with me. All right.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thanks, man. Over and out.
Over and
All right.
out.
All right.